Hello, friends of Studio Burley. This is Steve Burley, and it is coffee time, where we go over some of the stuff that's going on in the news since our last coffee break, which was just yesterday. So we're going to be digging back a little bit further than that to some of the mass shootings today that we've seen discussed, reported on in the media, but not really reported on sufficiently deeply, not with enough analysis, certainly not to the depth with which we need in order if we're serious about trying to address this problem. So with us today is Dr. Warren Farrell, who needs no introduction to most of you here. He's been, of course, working in the area of men's issues probably all his life, basically. Started as a feminist and all that story you know all about. But Warren has recently written a op-ed dealing with the issues surrounding men and boys that are, I would say, contributing to the increased incidence of gun violence that we're seeing around us in recent news. So with no further ado, I'm going to bring Warren into the conversation right now. Hey, Warren, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you, Steve?
Not bad. I'm here in the Dominican Republic, and you're in sunny California.
Yes, I think it's wonderful here, but it sounds like it's really been fantastic in the Dominican Republic for you.
It is normally, although I did move new apartments and having some real growing struggles in getting set up here, not the least of which is that my motorcycle was stolen 10 days after I moved in here.
Wow, that's not a good sign.
No, very bad. I was very attached to that motorcycle. In fact, anybody who's listened to the channel regularly has heard me talk fondly about my love of going on motorcycle rides. To me, it's one of the mind-clearing and the closest thing you get to flying and freedom for me.
Yeah. Yes, It is freedom-oriented, and as you know, you're 36 times more likely to die per mile on a motorcycle than you are. So there's a trade-off for that freedom, as you know. You know
something? There's no freedom in life without risk.
Well, there's a lot of freedom.
Freedom is dangerous.
Yeah, I almost wrote a book once called Trade-Offs, and it would say exactly, it would agree with that 100%.
Yeah, that's right. Freedom is risky.
Yes.
So, or really, what was the other thing there? Well, anyways, enough said on that. You recently wrote a op-ed, and I think, let me just flash it on the screen here, at least the title page, and then we'll jump right into that. What do you think, Warren?
Absolutely, sure.
Let me make sure I get the right one here. Whoops, here, just get the right article up. Here we go. Here on the website, White House Council on Boys and Men, and the title is "Boys Who Hurt Us Are Also Boys Who Hurt." Do you want to give us a thumbnail of your ideas that were in that op-ed, Warren?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I've seen over the course of doing the research for the boy crisis is that when there are boys, particularly boys who are dad deprived, I was noticing that the shooters, particularly the school shooters, were oftentimes dad deprived boys. We saw this with Adam Lanza, who did the Sandy Hook school shooting, and he hadn't even seen his father for 2 years. He was very young. He had a very combative, mutually abusive relationship with his mother. And he was, very upset about himself not doing well in school, and he was, basically both suicidal and homicidal. Now, when I say suicidal and homicidal, what I mean is that the mass shootings, whether they're school shootings or general mass shootings that don't include schools, are both homicides, obviously, and also suicides. The boy oftentimes ends his life by or young man ends his life by shooting himself, or also alternatively, his life is for all practical purposes ended. Nobody will want to deal with him in the future as a mass shooter or as a school shooter. And so when you look at it from the boy is both young, or the young man is both committing a homicide and or a suicide, you realize if he's committing the suicide also, that something is painful inside of him, that he's and that he's angry about what's causing that pain, and he feels that there's no hope of it changing. And so when I did the research for the boy crisis, I discovered a number of things. First of all, that the school shooters in particularly were almost always dad deprived. So, for example, the in since the year 2000 and the 21st century, there have been five school shooters who killed 10 or more people. And all five of them, for whom we have family backgrounds, well, there are six that killed 10 or more people. We have family backgrounds for five of those six. And for all five of them, they were all dad deprived boys, every one, 100% of the school shooters who killed 10 or more people in the 21st century. As I looked over the mass shooters in general, they tended to have four things in common. One is that they were almost all male, not all male, but about 99% male. Number two, they were boys who were dad deprived. And three is they were boys who were hurting. And I think there's a place in that article that you can even flash on if you wish to show that. And then there's the fourth. They were boys who, by definition, had guns. So they're male, the boys who are hurt, boys who are dad deprived, and boys who, by definition, had guns. And so these are the four essential components. But in the dad deprived boys and the boys who are hurt, there's a lot more psychological things that are opening up. Part of what I found as I did the research for the boy crisis was that there were 63 red flags of severe depression or suicide that boys manifested, many of which were manifested also by girls, but many of them were never included in the depression analysis that has been applied historically only to girls. We haven't looked at the different ways that boys manifest depression that oftentimes involves acting out and doing things like mass shootings, which are very rarely done by females as one of their manifestations of depression. And we have to also realize that this suicide propensity is very much a male thing as well. So I think I mentioned once before on your StreamYard that there was, that at the age of 9, boys and girls rarely commit suicide, and they commit suicide. But by the age of 10 to 14, boys commit suicide twice as often as girls do. Between the ages of 15 and 19, 4 times as often. And between the ages of 20 and 25, 5 times as often. So suicide tends to be a male thing, even though we've rarely analyzed it. When I tried to research this for the boy crisis, I went to multiple sources that specialized in suicide, and wondered why, given the fact that the ratio of male-female suicide in their early 20s is 5-to-1 male to female. There didn't seem to be hardly any analysis of what created suicide for boys, which is what led me to do this inventory. And when I questioned and pressed on that, a number of people were empathetic to the fact that, and they knew that suicide was far more current in boys. But everybody who's watching this show with you will immediately know what the answer is. And the answer basically was they could not get funding for which sex.
Yeah.
And so that's what led me to creating this inventory. And I'd love to, if you wish to, go over some of these red flags, because I imagine many of our listeners will feel like, oh my goodness, I didn't think about that as being something to take into consideration as part of what I need to do. And what you and I are talking about here today is preventing school shootings rather than talking about them. What we're doing with boys is basically, when boys feel upset or depressed, they're often feeling angry at themselves, at others who they feel have ridiculed them. For example, with Aaron Long in Georgia, he's a perfect example. He's the one that did the shootings of 10 or more people in Georgia, 10 people in Georgia. And what was the analysis of that? It was the way the media handled it was this was part of hatred of Asian women and Asians. But in fact, if you looked at what happened with him, he said over and over again that he was addicted to sexuality, but he was also part of a religion that prohibited extramarital sex and sex for pleasure, basically. So he was in this conflicted desires, addicted to something that his religion prohibited, and so it wasn't, in my opinion, likely to be Asian women in particular. He would have been upset at any people who were servicing his conflicted desires. You had addiction versus prohibition, and he believed fundamentally in his religion, and it was a very strict religion. And his father was a pastor, and he was a very fundamentalist, and so he was. The things inside of himself were disgusting him. He was ashamed of himself, most likely.
Can I
And
interject here for a
yeah, sure.
second, Warren, before I lose this thought? I mean, is it really an addiction that he had, or really was he obsessed with satisfying his sexual urges more so because it was so prohibited by his own belief system? I mean, his own religion, his own community looked at that as a terrible sin. He could not go down that road. And I almost think that the very fact that he was prohibited from going that road made him want to go down that road even stronger to satisfy those desires. And then that conflict just seemed to grow and grow. I don't know, why do you think we need to call in this specter of sex addiction in this particular case? Because he didn't seem to be seeking sex like every day, all day sort of thing. It was just, it exploded on the scene. And I can understand it. He's I'm not saying I understand his response to being violent, but I can understand him wanting sex. At a young guy filled with hormones, of course he's going to want sex.
Yeah.
And of course his community, which is very deeply fundamentalist religion on that kind of prohibitive sense, it must have been a horrible internal conflict to have to deal with. Even if we put sex addiction completely off the table, it would still be the same horrible conflict to deal with.
Yeah, first of all, you're absolutely right on at least part of this from my perspective, and that is that there's when something is prohibited, a number of things happen. Either it's prohibited and your desires are not so strong that you don't even allow yourself to think in that area of sexuality. And for many women, those that with less testosterone and less sexual drive than most adolescent males have, that prohibition is not so in such conflict with their sexual drive that they therefore can adhere to the prohibition without feeling too much guilt. Whereas with a heterosexual male who's very male oriented, who's he and his father's a pastor, and it's a fundamental religion, and you're told you're absolutely a sinner if you do this. Yes, the prohibition may even increase the desire, and it may also decrease the desire. But what we know for sure is it creates conflicted desires. And so now addiction. I define addiction as anything that we do that we do not, in retrospect, wish we had done, but we nevertheless did it despite not wishing we had done it, and we continue to do it over and over again despite wishing we had not done it. So I'm fine with drinking. I drink a little bit, but I've never been drunk. And why? And what's my borderline there? My borderline is if I've never been able to look back and say, I wish I hadn't said that or done that. I was only saying it and doing it because I was drinking. And so when somebody has such powerful drives that they're doing things that they wish they hadn't done, then that is and they continue to do that and feel driven to do that despite wishing they hadn't, then I call that an addiction. And so we can debate about that, but
it's a different definition of addiction than I would have subscribed to or that I'm familiar with. But continue on. That's
sure. So then the larger picture here is, so what he was trying to do, as he said, himself is basically kill the things that were tempting his desire, that were making him betray his religion and betray his inner feelings of what were good. And so I would say that we're saying that he hated Asian women, but I'm saying he would have hated anybody that serviced his conflicted desire. And so that's what created the pain for him. So here, instead of looking at what created the pain for Robert Aaron Long, we're looking instead at the victim being the Asian women. And of course, the victims were Asian women. And of course, we can never excuse anything like a mass shooting. We must never, say, oh, he's a victim, we shouldn't pay attention to it, or he's a victim, he shouldn't pay a full price for that. And so that should never be confused. But if we want to prevent school shootings and or mass shootings in the future, we have to pay attention to our boys, because this is both a suicide and a homicide. And when we don't pay attention to boys who hurt, they are much more likely to be the ones who hurt us. Or conversely, boys who hurt us are almost always boys who are also hurt. And so it behooves us, especially in this coming fall, if COVID starts coming back again in any way, shape, or form, we're going to have isolated boys who are not usually good, as a rule, at social skills, and they've been isolated from their male peers. Male peers are very important to boys as female peers are to girls. And so we're going to see a great deal, I predict, of potential school shootings. It's a setup for that, because they're males who are depressed, who are suicidal, who have access to guns, who are more likely to use guns that they have access to. And you put all that together, and they're much more likely to be hurt by dad deprivation. So that's what I looked at, and there's about 63 red flags too. And if you wish to, Steve, I'm happy to review some of those with you.
Yes, let's get into that. But before, let's just take a question here or a comment. And maybe you could comment on this before we get quite off of the addiction angle here. Mm-hmm. I found this an interesting question here. Derek Workman says, so is the addiction the sexual urges or the religious indoctrination? I think that's a fair question.
Very good. I would say both. The difference, though, is the religious indoctrination is what he wants to believe and wants to work with, and it has created him feeling guilty and not wanting to be sexual in the way that he is.
So why do we prioritize a person's wants? Especially people's wants are very often in conflict with what is good for them, actually. Well, if an addiction is something that drives you away from what you want, and then what if what you want is actually what's bad for you?
Yes, well, an addiction is usually what drives you. What prevents you from doing anything but what you want. You want to drink, want to take drugs, want to have sex, but it often and historically the sexual energy of males has been prohibited by religions, and the reason religions prohibited it is because not because of immorality per se, but rather because of immortality. So if you look in the Bibles of the stories of Uncle Laban and Jacob, Jacob was a very successful young man, and he was very attracted to Rachel, and Rachel was this beautiful woman, and so they decided to get married. And Uncle Laban, and so as Jacob took the veil off of his bride to be, he saw that it was not Rachel, but it was his sister. It was Rachel's sister, Leah, a relatively unattractive, homely female. But the deal was that he hadn't even been informed of. His uncle Jacob said, "You're a successful young male. We need to you need to be able to have sex and marry for a while, Leah, and then your reward will be having Rachel later." So the beautiful woman that he was most addicted to, the obligation of the culture was not to prohibit him from having sex, but to mandate that he never have that the sex that he had led to him being able to protect the children, new children being born. So the purpose of the sexual prohibitions were always to make sure you didn't have children that couldn't be supported. And the reason that sex was prohibited before marriage was because the basic deal in the society was, in exchange for one act of sex, young man, you will make a commitment to support this woman financially for a lifetime, and support all the children that you and she have together for a lifetime. It was, and one of the reasons why homosexuality was prohibited was because homosexuality was, let's say, an hour's worth of sex in exchange for an hour's worth of sex. For a heterosexual male, heterosexuality was an hour worth of sex in exchange for a lifetime of financial responsibility. And so it was a much better deal to be homosexual than it was to be heterosexual. And it was a much better deal to masturbate than it was to not masturbate. And so masturbation, homosexuality, anything that gave you sex without a financial obligation for a lifetime was prohibited by the Bible and by religions. And so that's, I believe, where that stems from. I describe this in much greater depth in the myth of male power, in a part of the myth of male power called immorality or immortality.
Right.
And so that's sort of a little bit about the background of why religions were concerned about procreating and having more people of that religion be able to populate the earth, and making sure that men did not get any satisfaction sexually until they committed to a lifetime of responsibility.
And of course, those restrictions were not imposed on those at the top of the social hierarchy, who basically behaved in whichever way they wanted to. And it sounds to me...
Let me stop you there, because that's a very important comment that you just made. There were always two groups of people who were sort of excluded from the rules of society. And they were like the upper, I would say, 1% economically, or economic power or political power, and also the lower 5 or 10%. Very poor people tended to skirt the rules, and very rich and wealthy people tended to skirt the rules. You're absolutely right.
And in a sense, most women were able to skirt most of the most oppressive, destructive, and imposing rules. For instance, going off to hunt and kill and be killed to protect the community. You know, they were excused from a lot of those duties in most cultures, as far as I understand.
Absolutely. Now, women did have a different set of responsibilities, obviously.
Yeah.
Women's role was to raise children and to sacrifice not even to think about a career.
Not that most of them wanted one.
Yeah,
to be fair.
Yeah, no, it may very well have been, but we have to separate. It's so difficult to separate biology and socialization, because women were not even taught. Nobody admired or worshipped women that were career focused that didn't have children, and just like nobody admired or worshipped men who were full-time dads. If and even to this day, if I were at a party and I was younger, and I said to a woman who came up to me at a party that, I'd like to spend my, lifetime raising children and being full-time dad, the woman would say just, "Oh, that's fascinating. Tell me more about that." Then she'd walk away to get another drink and never come back again. Maybe she'd send me a reporter over to interview me. But most women who want children do not want somebody who does not earn any money while he volunteers to take care of the children full time. Whereas today we have a much greater balance in terms of accepting women raising children full time, being full time involved with the workplace, or doing some combination of both. As you've heard me say before, women have three options: work full time, children full time, or some combination of both. And men have three options too: work full time, or work full time, or work full time.
Or drop out of society and live on the street. There's one of the other ones.
Yes, really.
I have another, just a comment. From a lot of what you were describing there, historical cultures and religions, and the role of those cultures placing a lot of pressure on men, at least from the men's side of it, It sounds more like some of those problems are of cultural origin, in that the culture is not as maybe as functional as it could have been, and not necessarily a result of an individual addiction. For instance, we are born with these urges programmed into us. We're going to hit puberty, and we are going to face those urges. Unless there's something seriously wrong with you as a human being, you're going to face those urges, and you're going to want to meet them every bit as strongly as if you're going to want to eat, and you're going to go to the bathroom later.
Absolutely. That's no conflict to what I'm saying. That's the strength of those biological urges are exactly what we have evolved as human beings to encourage males to be able to have urges that were so strong that the only thing we could do with them in a society where the only way you could fulfill those urges without being shamed, either shaming yourself or being shamed by others, was to get married and have children, to get married and fulfill those urges in a sexual framework. So basically, society used those biological urges to channel males' energy into not being able to to express those urges, feel ashamed if you express them by masturbating, feel ashamed if you express them by prostitutes, feel ashamed if you express them with somebody of the same sex. Now, there are cultures that worked this a little bit differently, and in some Middle Eastern cultures, that it was considered okay for you to be have sex with same-sex partners until you got married. Then, when you got married, you could not have sex with same-sex partners.
Well, that's interesting.
But after your children were, after you had finished the period that you wanted to procreate the children, you were allowed to go back to being homosexual again, so you wouldn't bother your wives with your sexual needs. And so that was the cultural understanding. Other cultures developed what I call, in the myth of male power, the marital triangle. And the marital triangle was sort of an understanding in the culture that the male could have a mistress only as long as he was taking good care of his wife and children. Then he could be free to not have to bother his wife with more sexual demands.
But he's supposed to take care of his mistress too, right?
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
The job, and here was the deal. The marital triangle was the wealthier man, and only the wealthier man. You choose a mistress. You take care of her until she finds a man she wants to marry who will take care of her. So you pass on the mantle of economically supporting her to the man who is eventually going to marry her. And then it's no longer okay to be sexual with that married woman, but it was okay to be sexual with that single woman. And so these are some of the heritages that are no one's fault, but it was society's way of being able to work for the function of the society about with the energy, the sexual energy that we as males have developed over the period of our evolution in exchange for that. And this is not just human males. This happens with insects, with buck elks, with animals of almost every part of the evolutionary ladder. Is the male sexual energy is so strong that he's willing to do things that are totally dysfunctional, with buck elks, to create these enormous antlers, because he knows only when he creates the enormous antlers will the female choose him to have sex with. And so he creates these enormous antlers, and when he does, those enormous antlers, in order to create those, you lose 30% of your minerals and your nutrients, and you are ready to die, because your body, you manifest with your antlers, you manifest as the strongest male, but in fact you are really the weakest male. And if you don't get rid of those antlers immediately after procreation, you're likely to die, because you won't have enough nutrients to last through the winter. And this is, as I've mentioned before on our podcast, this is a really good example of men's weakness being our facade of strength.
And to add to that, no, I have no issue with what you're saying there, except that in fact, in order to grow those antlers, it is a sign that that's a pretty damn strong beast to be able to produce those. I mean, it's a biologically expensive event, and only the strongest individual can pay that biological price. So in one way, yeah, he's weakened because of it, but it's only because he's so strong that he's able to produce that exhibition of strength.
Excellent point, and the answer is, in my opinion, is yes and yes. And that is the fascinating thing about masculinity. Only the strongest male could produce the biggest antlers, and the strongest male became the weakest in the process of doing it. The strongest male becomes the hero who goes to war and leads all the troops, but also makes himself very vulnerable to dying in the process.
Or he comes back severely injured, if not in body, in mind, and often can no longer function in the society that he protected. We're seeing that in spades in the U.S., all over the place now.
Absolutely, and then one of the things that if you, when I've interviewed veterans and that have been in PTSD situations, they've frequently been in PTSD situations from two types of vulnerabilities. Their best friend got killed right in front of them, or alternatively, in some like Middle Eastern cultures again, and in Israeli and Arab situations, oftentimes in many points in history, they sent very young boys, 8-year-old boys, 9-year-old boys, to the front lines of war, because they knew that that it would be almost impossible for the other side to kill young boys, and they were right. When we talk to people who were in a position to have to kill young boys, or even to that is one of the most trauma-creating experiences for any male. So males are not just worried about being killed. They're also worried about the trauma. They experience trauma from seeing somebody killed that they have been responsible for killing.
Excellent points, Warren. I think you have a lot of more material you want to get to, right? I just want to flash one thing up on the screen for people to see here. I don't think this is going to surprise anything, and certainly not going to surprise you, because it's in this article that was printed in March of this year, so about 2 weeks ago, actually supports exactly what you're saying, that hurt men hurt others. So, which is basically what you were saying in the beginning of this episode, if I summarize that correctly. So let's just flash this article up here. Gun deaths in the U.S. surged in 2020, data shows. North Carolina's spike was even bigger. Now, what do we know about 2020? Well, the government, on purpose, locks people in their homes, shuts down their lives, shuts down their livelihood, shuts down their schooling, shuts down their social life, shuts down everything. And yet, most of these people, especially on the left, they will point to this data and say, that is because of toxic masculinity, when it is not. It is a direct result of the deliberate shutdown of our economy, the deliberate shutdown, the deliberate execution of, or infliction of pain on the entire population. I would say if you're a sociologist and you didn't expect this, you don't deserve to publish another paper in sociology. I'm stating my position fairly strongly, but feel free to comment in any way you feel on that, Warren.
Yeah, I feel differently about. I think it's somewhat like a wartime situation where, during all wars in all societies, there's a loss of freedom that people experience in order to combat the enemy, and so in this case, the enemy is a disease that scientists feel has killed more than 500,000 Americans, and so there is a lot of sacrifice, and there's, at least the scientists feel, that there's a very strong correlation between like Israel and India and in Britain when there was a extremely strong shutdowns, there was a much more minimal impact negatively. And so different people have different perspectives on this, but I have a different feeling than you do about the tension that is true for every government that has an enemy. In this case, the COVID virus, and the enemy can always be argued in every war: is that enemy just a perceived enemy, or is that enemy a real enemy? Until there are many Jewish people in Germany who laughed at the need for Jews to leave Germany. They thought that Hitler was a non-entity that would never get into power, and others felt that Hitler was a very real entity that would get into power, and there was a need to leave Germany before Jews would be killed by him. And in the case of Hitler, obviously the right conclusion is apparent to us now. So I feel differently about the government conspiracy than you do, but what I don't feel differently about than you do is the importance of paying attention to what in boys is the red flags of depression and suicide that is leading to hurt boys. And I don't feel that hurt boys automatically hurt us, but I just know that among the people who do hurt us, who are there in a mass shootings type of way, they're almost always boys, and they're almost always boys who hurt. Some boys are hurting and they take it out just on themselves, like committing suicide, or they become addicted to video games and become depressed and die of drug overdoses and other signs of depression. And so the important thing is that there's among the boys who act out, almost always they are hurt. And one of the ways we can prevent that acting out and are being hurt is by having much finer radar to know the red flags of depression and suicide. So shall I go over a couple of those with you?
Yes, definitely. I'll just concur that, I agree with you. I see that the COVID response, certainly the response to the COVID pandemic, is not justified by the severity of the risk involved. There's some risk to this virus, but the response is way overreaction to this risk, and so that to me points to ulterior motives. But I don't want to derail this session, so let's get straight to because that's a whole other topic, obviously. Let's get straight to I'm going to put the notes up on the side so I can keep listing out these red flags and people can see them as you mentioned them. So just give me a second to put that note up over here. Okay, and just 1 second. Okay, so here, go ahead, Warren. I'm just putting this onto the side so we can write in here these as you say them.
Probably the most important one is to ask, and what I'm suggesting here is that this inventory be passed out at schools and discussed at family dinner nights, and everybody in the family, checking these things off. And one of the purposes of this inventory is that when a boy, say at school, gets this from the guidance counselor and has to fill this out, he may recognize things that are true of him, but he will say to himself, wow, I'm feeling like this wouldn't be here for me to check off if it wasn't something that was common to more than just me. And so one of the challenges of people, boys in particular, who do not have a lot of social permission to talk about their vulnerabilities, whether the boys or with girls, is that they're keeping it all to themselves, and that keeping it to themselves becomes a volcano that eventually explodes. And then we all walk around bewildered that what happened? Why did this happen? And so one of the positive functions of having everyone do this is for the boy to sort of realize that this must be, if this is written down for everyone to take, this must be happening to somebody more than me. So the first one is, do you feel that no one loves you who knows the real you? People may love you or like you or respect you, but you feel like you're hiding something that, and so therefore they really are respecting somebody who's different than the real you. So that's number one.
Let me just jot this down here. It's a little longer than just a second here.
So basically,
The real you.
do you feel no one? And if I can give this whole list to you, Steve, and you can put it up on your on as part of your show, if you wish to, or as part of what you put up for people.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can put it into the description of the video later. I just like to have it as at least a sentence on the side here as we talk, so that's easy to refer to.
Good. So the brief version of it, Steve, is: do you feel no one loves you who knows the real you?
Okay, I got that here. But Warren, this is always something that comes in my mind when we talk about, and this is basically getting men to open up and share their feelings. And I did go down that road a couple of times in my life, and I have to say it wasn't a pleasant experience. It was not, when I actually opened up and shared my pain, struggles, and feelings, it just doubled my pain, struggles, and feelings. It did not help. The feedback was never helpful. The feedback was, well, I shouldn't say never. There was occasionally when family came to help on a practical matter. But people don't like, to this day, I don't think their culture likes to see men expressing vulnerability in any way. This is you've talked about this before, I believe. This is a really tough problem to deal with there.
This is first of all, I 100% agree with you, actually, but what I'm saying is, if we want to change a culture that leads to boys feeling isolated and hurt and withdrawn and therefore depressed, and then in the worst case scenarios suicidal, and in super worst case scenarios being willing to kill people and angry at people that have in their perception created that hurt, like the Robert Aaron Long killing the women that serviced him, or the other shooter in Colorado killing the people who were mocking him as being a Muslim, and not being able to talk about it. It's the lack of being able to talk about it, and exactly what you're saying, are not rewarding and not encouraging boys, laughing at boys who do talk and open up. That then creates this volcano festering inside of them that in one way, shape, or form explodes, and that boy saying, I'm going to kill the people who are mocking me. I'm going to kill the people who have created this hopelessness and anger. So yes, our job as a culture is to say, this is creating, you want to talk about toxic masculinity? Your unwillingness as a culture to make it safe for boys to open up and be who they are, which is not just a stoic hero, or you don't want to hear about it. That's the toxicity that's creating males who can be toxic when they meet your toxicity.
Great way to say it, Warren. And I would say, as you were explaining that, I think men who do find themselves in a very supportive marriage, a very good relationship marriage, I think those men, and I've known some of them, they do open up to their wives, and their wives do listen to them. Their wives do soothe those wounds, if I can say it that way. And so those men have that, but it's in private only.
Yes.
Only in private.
That's
behind
right.
closed doors.
Yeah. And the other way that men have this is I formed, as you know, Steve, some 300 men's groups. And in those men's groups, one of those men's groups, as you know, was joined by John Lennon. And, one of the questions that I asked was that he joined the group after I left it. I would form a group and then leave them, and then form other groups. One of the questions I trained the men's groups to ask is, what is the biggest hole in your heart? And he said the biggest hole in his heart was that he had never gotten to know his son, and he'd been so preoccupied with his career that he could never really get to know his son, and he neglected his wife as well, and that led to a divorce, which led to him still not knowing his son. And now he just discovered at this point in time. When he was telling me all this, I didn't even know who he was. He sought me out at a party because he had joined the men's group and heard that I was the one that had formed that. And he was telling me that he was now married to a new woman, and she was pregnant, and they just discovered it was a boy. And he found this out and told the men's group this. And he said, the biggest hole in my heart is creating the biggest fear. And the biggest fear is I feel I will never be able to, that I'm going to repeat the same pattern again that I repeated in the past, because I'm tied into lots of contracts and I have a lot of obligations, and I'm better known than I was when I neglected my wife and children, and this is really I don't want to do this again. And the men's group said to him, sort of, well, what would it take for you to not to do this again? And so he said, well, I would love to, take off 5 years and take care of my new son. But that's a joke. I couldn't possibly do it. And through the support of the men's group, he talked to the woman that was now, that we now know as Yoko Ono, about this. She said, John, if this is what you want to do, you go ahead and do this. And he then took 5 years off, as we now know historically, to take care of his son, Sean. And this is, so the point of all of this is that he had this big hole in his heart. He didn't even feel he was, he seemed like one of the most powerful people in the entire world with the most ideal career in the entire world. And yet inside of him was this pain that he couldn't talk about with his business managers. He couldn't talk about with a wife that might be invested in him remaining successful and bringing in billions of dollars. But he could talk about with these men's group once there were two parameters. One is that the men's group needs to always be confidential, that you can feel, you can say anything, feel anything. You can feel anger, hurt, pain, negative feelings, misogynist feelings, misandrous feelings, self-hatred feelings, and that will stay in the group. And number two is that no one in the men's group dominates the group, that there's methods that I've developed that I talk about in some of my books about how to run a men's group that doesn't become dysfunctional. So all of this is a structural way of handling men's feelings in a more traditional environment. When I've spoken at the places like the Brooklyn Baptist Church in Bedford-Stuy in New York, which is one of the poorest communities in the world, in the country rather, and it's a 100% Black audience of about 1,000 people I was speaking to. And afterwards, the minister took me back and got me together with 4 men's groups that he had formed in a faith-based community. And 28 out of the 32 boys said that they would still be committing the crimes that led them to be in prison if it wasn't for the faith-based experience that they had of being able to talk to other boys and being guided and supported to do that by this faith-based, this wonderful minister who not only facilitated this in boys, but made sure he talked to each boy as an individual aside from the group as well. So this is the type of support systems, whether you're faith-based and traditional, whether you're more sort of liberal and whatever, of boys being able to speak and men being able to speak with men, that is total. This is where men will be evolving to if we decide that in the future we would like to treat men as human beings rather than as human doings.
Excellent description, Warren. And the what struck me there is that all of these situations are, again, they're in private. And that also speaks to the fact that even with all these groups emerge and are formed because of the need to privatize the fact. And we need to privatize men's pain because the culture, the open on the street sort of popular culture, still stigmatizes men who express vulnerability.
Yes.
So what we're talking about right now is, again, reproducing what was once, say, a healthy marriage, but with men's groups, where men can actually open up.
Yes. And where there's a different cultural milieu created. So, for example, we all, or many of us, realize that that hashtag Me Too allowed a lot of women to open up and express feelings that that many of us didn't even know that are the women that we loved, our mothers, our sisters, our wives, had experienced when they were younger. And that was wonderful for women to open up and do that. But it's ironic that the culture, that the group of people, the sex, the gender, that already is more likely to have a support system for opening up was the first one to get a hashtag Me Too. My criticism, I have a support for hashtag Me Too, but I have a complete opposition to it as a hashtag Me Too monologue. There has to be a hashtag Me Too dialogue. Men not only have the same type of feelings and fears of rejection and loneliness and isolation, and times when they feel like they were tried to be a really good father, and then they were left by a woman who then accused them falsely of being a bad father or a bad man, or a false accusation of abuse, because that allowed them to have the children full time. And then they lost their children as well as their wife after divorce. These are just one example of the hashtag Me Too that would be potentially expressed in the culture by men. But we haven't even asked men to do this. We've created a White House Gender Policy Council that focuses, it's called a Gender Policy Council. And despite being called a Gender Policy Council, it focuses only on one gender, which is women and girls, and not at all on boys and men. And so this is so the cultural, so it's ironic that where there's already more cultural permission to open up, we've created a hashtag Me Too. Where there's less permission, almost no permission to open up, we haven't even invited men to have their own hashtag Me Too.
Worse than that, even men who do start to talk about that, the first thing that you're confronted with is, oh, so you hate women.
Yes, and if you
That's the first response. I'm just going to say one more thing before I let you respond to this. I'm going to flash this comment on the screen here for a second, so we see exactly where this is coming from. Because I had the same thought when you were talking about Me Too, and from the things that I've seen happen about Me Too, there's an awful lot of bad, and it far outweighs the good. I have to question whether there is really any good coming from Me Too, because women have always expressed their feelings before Me Too. I've been hearing these stories all my life. Women never, in my experience, women never felt that they were refrained from telling their bad stories about men. I've heard it all my life. So let me just read this. Mouse Utopia suggests that I challenge you about the, quote, benefits of Me Too. This fellow believes it was all bad. Now, I don't know whether I believe it's all bad or not, but I haven't seen the good side of Me Too. I'll put it that way. I have not seen a good side to Me Too. What I've seen is celebrity women virtue signaling for even more attention and even more celebrity and even more privilege. That's what it comes across as to me. But obviously, you know where I'm coming from in this. And so I invite you to respond to that, Warren.
Yeah, just that I have seen my own wife and my sister and women friends of mine have expressed feelings to me about their experiences they had during their life with doctors that they felt violated them, and so on. And and if a doctor violated me in the same way, I would enjoy it. But for women, there are different feelings around sexuality, and there are like, for example, the women who talked about Weinstein and Harvey Weinstein and what happened to them, or what they feel happened to them. Now, I feel there's a totally different story also that's missing from that. So, for example, with Cuomo, I feel the whole Cuomo incident is a really good example of this. So, for example, the women are saying 10, 20, 10 X number of years later that they felt in a powerless type of position, or an uncomfortable position with Andrew Cuomo making what they perceived as sexual advances at them. So what do we do with that? One is, I would say, first, let's say to women and men, when we're in this all together, three or four things. One is, rather than just blaming men when they take sexual initiatives that you don't want, why don't we create a culture where we're expecting girls and young women and women of all ages to be sharing the risks of rejection that we now expect only men to share, and that no woman is volunteering to share equally the risks of rejection, not by option, but by expectation. So, right now, very few women reach out and take risks of asking a man, implying to a man, I'd like to be sexual with you. Would you like to go out with me? And would you like to be, I'd like to be close with you, in that type of physical way. And so we are not hearing the supposed movement for equality say we want to encourage our daughters to equally share the risks of rejection. Again, not by option, which women now have the option to do, but by expectation. Number two, we're not saying to women, if you're in a position like this with Andrew Cuomo or some other powerful man, it's very understandable that you feel uncomfortable or you have an experience of powerlessness. But rather than talking about it 10 years later, your job is to express that feeling of discomfort to the man at the time that you're experiencing and feeling that discomfort. So he has the option of knowing that you're feeling uncomfortable and backing off and not violating what makes you feel uncomfortable. You need to tell him at that time. Will that be a little bit hard for you to do? Yes, it may be hard for you to do, but it's also your responsibility rather than keeping that to yourself and then accusing him of it 10 years later. Third, we need to make sure that the woman then makes it clear to the man, I'm not interested, Andrew, in being sexual with you. That will never change. And it won't change if you promote me or invite me to certain parties. I'm not going to exchange your invitations for making me more powerful for being sexual with you. On the other hand, should that change because my internal sexual desires change, not the amount of bribes you give me to be sexual with you, if my internal sexual desires do change, I will take the responsibility of letting you know that. So therefore, I don't want you to ever make these feelers again or whatever is making me uncomfortable again. Fourth, the next thing that has to be understood is that people like Andrew Cuomo, that we understand that they have their own experience of powerlessness. This is the hashtag #MeToo of men, which is that they have in front of them a beautiful, younger, talented, responsible woman, puts it all together, and a single man like Andrew Cuomo or even a married man is feeling a real draw to this woman who has youth power, who has beauty power, who has intellectual power, and he is attracted to her. But he feels very vulnerable also because he's feeling that he doesn't have this youth power, this beauty power that she has. He has a different type of power, and the only thing that he can have, but no one is talking about the fears of rejection that he is experiencing by even putting out these sexual cues. And so that's what would be contained in a hashtag #MeToo dialogue. And it's one of the reasons why, in some ways, the person who just communicated with you, the hashtag #MeToo monologue in isolation is much, much, much more bad than good. But if it had not been in isolation and it was part of getting both sexes to open up about their feelings and fears and what's going on, it has the potential for becoming something that is of use for cultural transformation.
Well, that's an interesting perspective for sure. I can't argue with some of your specifics there. I think well, I'll just comment on a couple of quick things here that came to mind. In my upbringing, I don't know when women became shy to say no. That's not my experience as a teenager or even as a young man. No, women were never shy to say no. But surely they would flirt and they would appear to be sexually available, sexually interested, and invite those approaches. But I never saw them shy to say no. I don't know when this happened, or if it's even really true, or if it's just another deceitful power play, pretending that they felt too unempowered to say no. That's a possibility. I don't know if you've thought about that or commented on that in the past.
Yeah.
Just one other thing I want to just say, if you want to respond to that, I'll give you a second in a second.
Yeah.
That when you mentioned that if a female doctor in that position came on to you in a similar situation, that I forget, someone you mentioned had that incident happen to her. As this happened to me, and it was at U.S. immigration. I had to go for a full medical. The U.S. doctor in Ottawa was a female, an older female, and very weird older female, and she was giving me a prostrate examination while eyeing me and winking at me on the table. And I can tell you this, I could not wait to get out of there. Mm-hmm. But I would never think of reporting it to the police. You know why? Because the only thing that could happen is they'll deny my U.S. immigration. That's the only result. Yeah. And that's a female doctor, and she's probably been doing that all her career and laughing about it.
Yes. Yes.
So, and do you think that this revelation would get any attention at all, anywhere, or any traction? The only thing that I would get as a response, this is my firm conviction, from complaining about this or revealing this, I think I've talked about it online before. The most likely response would be further ridicule, further humiliation. That's what I get. I don't see any of that being treated probably ever in our culture, if I have to say it that way, being treated seriously. Because this was not a pleasant. I did not like it. I did not welcome it, and it was distinctly unpleasant.
Good. Yeah, I mean, yes, and I agree with you about all of the predictions as to what could potentially happen, or at least your fears of what would potentially happen, and so this type of thing has happened to many women who have not felt able to be open about this until #MeToo. And
Warren, hold on. I really have to call you on this, because Me Too started about 8 years ago, maybe?
With the Harvey Weinstein thing, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So let's say in the 2012 region or whatever. I forget the exact dates, or maybe it's a little before, a little bit later. But are you seriously suggesting that women's complaints of sexual assault and rape were not treated seriously in the 1990s, for instance, or the early 2000s? Because it's been treated seriously all my life. Mm-hmm. That's been my experience.
Yes, well, certainly accusations of rape have been, but many women who had experiences somewhat parallel to what you experienced have not felt comfortable talking about it. And the #MeToo has freed it for them. My problem, as I said, with the #MeToo is it has made it look like it's males who are doing these things to women, and it has repressed men's perspectives, men's experiences, and therefore has created an atmosphere in which the assumption is that males are the oppressors, the rapists, the sexual harassers, the date rapists, and so on, and that a woman should be so believed that even that man can't have a say. And we've institutionalized that by eliminating in colleges and universities due process, where a man who is accused, a young man who's accused in college of sexual harassment or date rape, isn't even entitled to due process, to have the lawyer that represents him cross-examine the other, the woman or the woman's lawyer. And this is absolutely a perfect example of something that might have had some good in it, and I would say did have some good in it. Is not overall good because of the fact that it's a one-sided experience, and it's in a sense a social violation of due process. We have not allowed men to speak up, encouraged men to speak up, and they were already the sex a lot less inclined to speak up. And our violations are not usually as often violations of a woman being sexual with us, but rather they're violations of A woman coming back 10 years later and claiming something from her perspective that we saw totally differently and we're not even allowed to talk about it. Or a divorce situation in which a woman falls in love with a new man and wants to move away from the father out of state. And this, instead of being contested with, and then says a lot of negative things about him, and creates a type of parental alienation situation, which the work of Glynis Walker has found is 5 times more likely. When she interviewed the children of divorce, that both girl and boy children said that their mothers were 5 times as likely to say negative things about the father than the father was to say negative things about the mom. Parental alienation is real. It's being challenged now as not real, largely as a result of the whole Woody Allen movie. And this is the type of thing that is much more likely to be the experiences that males have as part of their hashtag Me Too. And that's what we need to encourage to be out in the open, as opposed to be repressed.
Yeah, one of these female typical ways of abusing men is to draw into play the cultural tools like the court, like the court of public opinion and your reputation, your job, and to get those institutions to do the dirty work for them.
Yes,
right?
as you know, in the Myth of Male Power book, I talk about the female forms of abuse, and one of those is reputation ruining. And so there's a huge number of things that the Boy Crisis book and the Myth of Male Power are filled with, that are things that men need to be, that would be part of a hashtag Me Too for men. And almost every single one of them is not part of the cultural zeitgeist at this moment.
Yeah, the Myth of Male Power is clearly a classic piece of work. I think this will endure for generations. So again, I frequently praise it.
I wish it would not. You go ahead. Steve, I'm sorry, I interrupted what you were saying there.
No, not at all. I think you wanted. Let's get a couple more of these your more important red flags down here before we have to sign off, because we're a little over an hour now.
Yeah, we did a little.
Excuse me.
And actually, I have another.
Oh, it's been a great conversation, Warren. I mean, I'm all for letting the conversation go to where it needs to go during the interviews. But let's just take a minute or two to put a couple of what you think are the most important red flags to look for in the topic of this discussion, which is hurt men tend to hurt society, hurt others. Hurt men hurt others.
Yes, and I would just take a little bit of an exception to that. It is not hurt men that always hurt others. They don't tend to hurt others, because many hurt men just hurt themselves.
Right,
but
right.
Among those boys and men who do hurt others, you will almost always find a hurt man or a hurt boy. And so this inventory of the 63 red flags of somebody that might feel hurt. What I'm encouraging in the Boy Crisis book, which is where this inventory is in, is that we ask all boys these questions and girls these questions as well, so we can start seeing the red flags before they act out in the form of things like mass shootings. So number 2 is, do you feel that no one needs you? Boys in particular need to feel needed. Which is why Uncle Sam needs you was said in World War II, and boys were willing to give up their lives and risk being killed because they felt they were needed. Boys, every generation has had its war. In that generation's war, boys were told they were needed. The willingness of males to respond to being told they're needed is so strong, they're willing to die to provide someone else with needs. So if a boy feels with what they need, so when a boy feels that no one needs him, he often feels without purpose and aimless, and that's the beginning of a sort of a loneliness, a depression, and that can lead to suicide and in its worst case scenarios, or a shooting. The third is, Do you feel there is no hope of people loving you or needing you in the foreseeable future? So you may feel that there is no one who needs you, but you might have a hint that if you spoke up to somebody, that or that there is someone around you somewhere that might love you or might need you, and so that there's some hope, then that diminishes the likelihood of committing suicide. But if you feel there's no hope of that changing, then that is an additional indicator. Do you feel that if you discuss your real fears with someone that you may lose that person's respect? Whenever you hear of gang warfare or almost anything with males, you'll often hear the word respect. And so a man that doesn't feel respected usually doesn't feel loved, wanted, or needed by a male peer or by his parents. And if a female doesn't respect him, he knows that no woman will love a man that she doesn't respect. So he therefore implicitly feels devoid of love and respect. And that's one of the red flags that can signal potential depression. Do you feel ashamed? A new one. Do you feel ashamed of something you've done that has recently been or may soon be exposed? For example, you cheated. You're seen as the best student in the school, but you know you cheated on a test, and you expect that the test is now being reviewed, and you expect that you will be discovered to be a fraud. Did you cheat on a significant other, or what we call cheating on a significant other? And now you realize it's going to be found out. Did you cheat in business? Take money from do a Bernie Madoff type of situation who died just the other day, and now you're going to be exposed. And so if you feel that your honor and the respect that you've garnered over your lifetime is likely to be exposed, and you're likely to be exposed as a fraud, that's a red flag of depression/suicide, possible shooting. Have you recently, in the last year or two, dropped out of school? Boys who drop out of school are more than 20% likely to be unemployed in their early 20s. That's the statistic before COVID, when the United States had a 3.6% unemployment rate. Boys who dropped out of school in their early 20s had a 20+% unemployment rate. And girls don't tend to look in unemployment lines for boys they'd like to marry, have sex with, or have children with, and so it leads to a boy feeling like he's a failure, and why should he live? Another is, are you unemployed? Even more important, have you been unemployed for more than a year? Even more important, have you been unemployed for more than a year with a family to support? Because then you start feeling shamed, a lack of respect, and a lack of being able to fulfill what you were needed to fulfill. Are you unemployed with family to support and less than 3 months worth of savings? Do you feel you were let go from work because the employer wasn't happy with your work, with you, or with both you and your work? Are you Caucasian or Native American? Many people go, why that? Because the great majority of school shooters and mass shooters are Caucasian and Native Americans, and the highest percentage of suicides come from Caucasians and Native Americans.
Okay, let's talk about that one for a second, Warren, because you're opening up a can of worms there.
Yep.
Okay, how is this related to percentages? For instance, Caucasians are 68% of the U.S. population, roughly, something like that.
I know that African Americans or Black people are 11 to 12% of the total population.
Right. I think it's in the 68-70% range. So clearly, demographically, you would expect, even just from random statistics, that the majority would be Caucasian, wouldn't you?
Yes. So you'd expect maybe 68% of the mass shooters to be Caucasian, but we find that the mass shooters are to a much higher degree Caucasian or Native American, actually Caucasian, but suicides are much higher, disproportionately Native American or Caucasian. Among the Black community, there's a lot of when a male is depressed, he's more likely to commit a crime. He's more likely to kill another Black person. He's more likely to do something that is deal drugs, join a gang. Those are so Black and Caucasian and Native American people have different ways of acting out. Among Caucasians, it's not just the Caucasians that commit suicide. It tends to be Caucasians who are middle and upper middle class, who oftentimes the suicides are Caucasians who are middle and upper middle class usually, and they're usually middle class males whose families have created expectations for them that the Caucasian male feels he is disappointing. And
Warren, to what degree are those expectations exactly from the family actually coming from the culture in general? And not only that, but all of my life, like all my adult working life, in the media, in our culture, there's been a ramping up rhetoric of blaming exactly that group of people for absolutely everything in the world. And not only that, reducing their opportunities in the world. There's a affirmative action started in 1984 in Canada, and I think in a similar time frame in the US, and that absolutely resulted in removing opportunities for that exact cohort of people, both in getting jobs and getting promotions and even getting, I won't even say respect in society, I'm going to say tolerance in society.
Okay,
So
what we have to do is look. What you're talking about is a bad conclusion from important data. So, for example, it is important for us to look at why are most of the mass shooters Caucasian, but not blame. But remember, we're talking here about what creates the hurt and the pain. So, what is there? And so the laws should not be to punish right, what is creating the hurt and pain. If the Caucasian male becomes a mass shooter, then we have to punish, of course. But the way the whole purpose of our dialogue here is how to prevent mass shootings and how to prevent school shootings, to look at the pain that is created and how that pain is created. And when we look at and interview the families of many mass shooters and school shooters, we see oftentimes that there were, but not so much the mass shooters as people who commit suicide. It's the suicide that often is not in mass shooting form, that happens among males who are in middle or upper middle class situations where there's the expectation that you should get into Harvard or Yale. And then maybe your parents help manipulate you through legacy into a Harvard or Yale or Princeton, and you're now doing poorly and you're about ready to drop out. And your brothers and your sisters, they've all graduated and done better, and you're the failure in the family. That's the type of thing. So the issue, the conclusion that the world has come to, the developed world has come to, of blaming and withholding opportunities from Caucasian males is the wrong conclusion. But looking at when a family is making something like a very high expectation, like graduating from an Ivy League school, very important, and that the boy who hasn't done what the family's expectations are is considered a loser, and the boy feels that. I'm asking us to see that as a red flag, that situation. So, and maybe take a different approach to that boy. Like, what other gifts do you have? What other things can you potentially be rewarded for? Are you a sensitive boy who is not maybe gifted at the things that we have a family expectation for, but you have other sensitivities, like you're the future Van Gogh, who would end up committing suicide because no one understood the value of his paintings. But we as your family can begin to honor you for things that you might have talents for that we are not programmed to honor people in our family for. My own father, as I've mentioned to you before, was very much critical of me for becoming a writer, because he felt that there was no that only 1 out of 100 writers ever succeeded in even getting a publisher. And if I couldn't find a publisher, I wouldn't be able to find a wife. And I was being totally irresponsible for going into something as irresponsible as writing. So that's a little bit of that. Let's pick up on this. I know we've both gone over. I have another interview coming up. So I hope we can leave this here and maybe come back to some other things on this list in the future.
Let me take a moment to just highlight a comment. I think I want to highlight this because I think this is very important. As a result of the kind of work that you're doing and the kind of work that we try to promote here at Studio Brûlé and other channels. This fellow commented that, JL, that he has an 18-month-old son, and listening to you talk about the boy crisis has helped me to realize how important I am to him, and that what I am doing has value, and he thanks you for that. And I think this is a very important thing to highlight, because it also, not only because it's true, but that it shows that the message is getting through to some people, people who are looking, and it also speaks to this idea you mentioned in item number 2 over here, which is to say that no one needs you. Yes, your son, your children need you. Much in contrast, much as how our popular culture ignores this or pretends that it's not true, the fact is your kids need you as a father far more than our culture will ever admit, certainly than it currently does. And that's part of our work here, is to point out the importance of men's work. That it should be obvious, but the importance of men's work both in the home and in the workplace and in the home as parents.
First of all, I really want to thank that person for letting me know that, because it helps me feel like I'm contributing something. And then secondly, I hope that especially you'll look at the portions of the boy crisis that deal with the ways that the dad-style parenting and why dad-style parenting creates so many positive outcomes for our sons in particular, also for our daughters. And the other one is spending some time with how to construct a family dinner night without it becoming a family dinner nightmare. In the appendix of the book, I give all the structure for that. But but throughout the Boy Crisis book, I talk about a lot of issues that are very touchy, tough issues to talk about, like we're all talking about here, and how to allow each person's individual perspectives to be revealed at the family table. And that's not just the respective perspectives of the children, but also to how to socialize the children to respect and pay attention to the parents' feelings, and the parents to draw out the children's feelings, so that children and adolescents don't feel that the only person that understands them is their male or female teenage counterpart, but rather that understanding can come in the family, and the family can become what I call e pluribus unum, one from many, that each of the many people in the family's individualities are recognized, and the family, the unit that facilitates that, is the one that creates the one from many.
Oops, there, my system was a little slow to respond there. Sorry about that. I want to just point out to the audience here that I tried to look at the comments, but I'm sure there's a lot of comments that slipped by without me getting to draw attention to them. A lot of good comments in there. We have been going. Warren has to go shortly, so unfortunately I won't be able to get to any more of the comments on this session. Warren, do you want to add 1 or 2 items to the flag list, or you have any wrap-up message you want to say before we wrap up today?
Yes. First of all, my email is warren@warrenfarrell.com. If you wish to talk with me about anything, or get a response, or be, one of the things that I care a great deal about is being able to communicate and hear each other. And I'm creating a couples communication course to make that I'm finishing off now, that I've spent some 30 years working on. And so if you're interested in communicating with me about that, or knowing other things that I do, feel free to just email me directly. I answer every email, even if it's just briefly. So I'll be happy to hear from you.
Okay, and I put the email in the comments there, email address in the comments there for anyone who wants to follow up on that.
And one more thing on that is, I have found the responses I'm getting is that a lot of men in particular are really enjoying the audible version of the book. If you're somebody that does working out or takes trips or commutes, some people enjoy hearing me read the book, my portion of the book, in my own words. And John Gray, the guy who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, if your son has ADHD or daughter has ADHD, he's really created a number of understandings of how to prevent the ADHD or reverse it without using drugs.
Terrific. Thank you, Warren, for that. And of course, that's all available on Amazon.com, right?
Yes, that's by far and away the least expensive way to get it, and they're having a sale on that now. But if you have a bit more income, support your local bookstore.
True. If there are any left open after this pandemic.
Yeah, right.
Thank you once again, Warren. It's always terrific to have you on, and Warren will be back again. This is a regular segment now. Probably, I think it's been once a month or once every 6 weeks for the last little bit, Warren?
Yes, exactly. Well, I
Okay.
look very forward to it. You're just a wonderful dialoguer, and I really enjoy back and forth with you, the areas where you agree, the areas we disagree, and the areas of creating greater clarity after we both talk about them.
Terrific. Likewise. And I have great respect for your work, specifically, particularly Myth of Male Power came out 25 years ago? 30 years ago?
28 years ago, yeah.
28 years ago.
Doing a revision.
Incredible. And it's as relevant or more today than it even was when you wrote it.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, once again, thank you, Warren, and thank you, folks, in the comments and all viewers and supporters of Studio Brûlé. We will be back again shortly. I haven't scheduled the next live stream, but at the end of every live stream, I would like to remind everyone to do something you love to do it today, do it every single day. And if you don't have something you love to do, find something you love to do and do it. That's one of the things that has kept me going through some of the toughest times of my life. Make time every day. It's your life, today, tomorrow, and every day. So do something you love to do every single day. And with that, I'll sign off for today.
Bye-bye.